Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to today's webinar hosted by the Columbia University Center on Global Energy Policy. Our focus today is exploring an uncertain energy future, and we'll look in particular at the Energy Perspectives 2021 document that has been released by Equinor. My name is Jonathan Elkind. I'm a senior research scholar here at the center. Some of you may have been expecting my colleague, Dr. Melissa Lott, as our host today, but unfortunately, Melissa is out ill, and so I am the cheap stand-in in her place. As I said, we're discussing Equinor's Energy Perspectives 2021 today and the different scenarios that it includes for the future of the energy system. Let me say as we start that this event is being webcast live, and the full video will be available online in the coming days. For those of you who are joining us using Zoom, you will be able to submit a question for the panelists at any time by clicking on the Q&A button that you'll find at the bottom of your screen. So today we're extraordinarily happy to have with us three excellent presenters. Eirik Wærness, from Equinor, the chief economist at that company, will start us off. Eirik is senior vice president and chief economist at Equinor. He will present some of the key findings from the Energy Perspectives 2021 document. And then we will be joined by Dr. Jennifer Winter, who is associate professor in the Department of Economics and the scientific director for Energy and Environmental Policy Research Division within the School of Public Policy at the University of Calgary. Along with Jennifer, we will be joined by Dr. James Glynn, who is my colleague at the Energy Center at Columbia. He's senior research scholar at the Center on Global Energy Policy. We are very, very pleased to kick off by asking Dr. Eirik Wærness to join us and take the floor and present to us on Energy Perspectives 2021. Eirik, over to you.
Thank you. Thank you for that very nice introduction, John, and good afternoon to everybody in the time zone equal to New York, and good evening to myself and to those that might follow this from the European side of the Atlantic. And it's a great pleasure to be back, though virtually, at your center, the Center for Global Energy Policy at Columbia. I've been there several times, and it's an honor to be back and present our Energy Perspectives publication where we look out to 2050 and look at global energy markets. This publication came out in June and is still relevant, we think, and in particular with a just recently published World Energy Outlook from the IEA. And I'll try and share my slides here for you, and I hope that works. Please let me know if it doesn't, and I hope you can see it.
Not just yet.
Not yet. Then it moves around here a bit. So let's see now. Here we go.
That's looking better.
That's looking better.
Yes, yeah. Got it.
Got it. So this is our Energy Perspectives front page, illustrating three different worlds in this, and I'll come back to what those are. But when we're looking out to 2050, and especially with the year we had behind us in terms of COVID, and the year we were in the middle of when we made these forecasts and scenarios, and the year we're still in, I should say. Well, of course, we have to look at the consequences both for global energy markets, the global economy, and not to forget the humanitarian toll of the COVID virus. Some of us might believe that we're out of this very shortly. I'm in a lucky position to live in Norway, and we are very close to being back to a normal situation. But we should remember that for many parts of the world, in terms of humanitarian toll and deaths, 2021 will probably be a worse year than 2020 was. even though we in the rich parts of the world now see economies coming back and energy demand coming back up in large parts of the emerging economies of the world, COVID is still very, very much being felt, and it has very serious consequences. And in terms of what happened in the energy markets last year, the curve to the left here, the curves to the left here show both the significant impact on global GDP on an annual basis compared to the year before, the massive reduction in oil demand, which on an annual basis led to a roughly 10% reduction because of the lockdowns, because we didn't travel, and that has a much bigger impact on oil than on gas, as an example, but also gas demand fell significantly, and both oil and gas demand will come back to the 2019 levels. Gas demand is probably back already, and oil demand will be back very, very soon. And there's no indication that we, as part of the COVID-19 shock, were able to speed up the energy transition so fast that we don't come back to the levels of oil and gas demand that we had just before the crisis. And you look to the right there, you can see the impacts on GDP growth, and basically what the pandemic meant was that almost all countries in the world were in recession back in 2020, with negative growth rates or growth rates that are lower than what they have to deliver on for not being in a recession. China was hit first by the COVID and got control the first as well, and you can see that also on a relatively moderate impact on GDP growth, even though 0 to 3% positive growth in China is probably within recessionary territory there as well. And then energy use is now increasing. It was actually increasing on average even in China. CO2 emissions in China went up from 2019 to 2020, even though the first month of that year meant a significant reduction. In the rest of the large countries in the world, emissions in 2019 came significantly down compared to the year before as a consequence of the reduced energy use. And since energy use is still 80% fossil, the reductions in energy demand translates into lower emissions. Vice versa, since the energy transition has not come very far yet, once the economy is picking up again, once we start to move around again, which we have, and this is an indication of community movement, energy demand goes up, CO2 emissions go up, and 2021 will deliver global emissions that are much higher than in 2020. And there's still a lot of potential for increased movement, by the way, both in terms of low capacity utilization in global economies, supply chains that are not being repaired again, and continued economic growth. And air traffic is probably one of the examples where we now see very rapid growth again, but it will take quite a while before we're back, if ever, to the demand levels and the movement levels that we used to have before the pandemic hit. So then when we look further into the future, an important fact and thinking about the possibilities of delivering on a sustainable development for the world, both in terms of sustainable development goals in general, and in particular regarding Sustainable Development Goal number 13 on climate change, it's important to realize that we live in a very, very unbalanced world. 15% of the global population live in the dark colored countries in that map. We have access to almost 2/3 of global income and thereby purchasing power, and we use close to 40% of global energy. If the rest of the world aspires to our lifestyle, if not standard of life, but lifestyle, we will have no chance of delivering on a sustainable development in terms of resource use and climate change. So things have to happen in order for this to go in the right direction. And then the question is, in what direction is the world moving? That depends with which window you're looking out of. As normal, we can find a lot of different signposts out there depending on whether we're focusing on economic growth, on energy efficiency, technology development, climate ambitions, market regulations, geopolitics, geopolitical change. And if you use some of those signals as indicators for where the world might be going, you can paint very different pictures of where the world might be going, depending on which of those variables you choose. And here are some indications that would indicate that if the drivers behind them were to prevail for a long period, you can get a very different world if you focus on the red ones here. For instance, our inability to spread vaccines more evenly across the world than we did. The signals of weakening of several international institutions that we've seen over several years, and the uneven recovery from the COVID pandemic, also between rich and poor economies. If that type of sentiment, those type of drivers prevail, we will have a very different world 10 to 15 years down the road, compared to if the drivers behind what we see on the right here prevail. Net zero ambitions are increasing between governments or among governments and companies. There's a growing support for carbon capture and storage and hydrogen development. The United States is perceived to be back to taking the leadership on climate issues, which it wasn't a couple of years back. If those drivers drive the development, we'll have a very different world than if the red variables drive. And similarly with other combinations of signposts that we see around us. And we've used these to develop different scenarios. We have two that capture where the world could be heading. Those are forecasting scenarios as normal. Reform is one of them. It's the central one on many of these variables. It's a scenario that builds on assumptions where economic growth will still continue to be in focus in terms of policy preferences. It's a more market and technology driven scenario than policy driven in terms of climate policies once we get beyond 2030. In the current world, in the current period, we believe it's the policy momentum on climate change will continue. What we actually see right now, the movement towards carbon pricing, et cetera, et cetera. It's a world that is not sustainable in terms of delivering the necessary CO2 emission reductions consistent with climate targets. But it's a scenario. It's a world that becomes much more energy efficient, less carbon efficient, and with a relatively high GDP growth going forward. Then we have another scenario which we call rivalry, which has more focus on energy security. It has more. We cannot exclude that the current situation in terms of geopolitical uncertainty, volatility, conflict on trade, protectionism, sanctions against regimes or countries we don't want to trade with, we don't trust. If that type of sentiment is allowed to continue for a longer period, we will have much less technology development, less income to finance the transition, more focus on energy security, and therefore higher use of indigenous fossil fuels than you otherwise will, than you have in the reform scenario. It's a scenario that delivers lower economic growth, but higher emission intensity, lower development of energy efficiency than reform. And of course, it's not sustainable in terms of climate change. Then we have a path to what we believe is a sustainable future. We call it rebalance, starting with the unbalanced world that I talked about. Now it's rebalance. That's a backcast. That's a scenario like the IEA 1.5 degree scenario in terms of backcasting a carbon budget. It presume, and then we talk about, well, how can we get there? And that requires immediate and coordinated international action, basically 2 years ago. Kind of like the IEA 1.5 or net zero emission scenario. This scenario is consistent with the well below 2 degree Paris Agreement. We have a higher carbon budget there than in the than in a 1.5 degree scenario, so we don't get all the way there. I'll come back to that. And we put more weight also on delivering on the 16 other sustainable development goals than climate change, in addition to climate change. So there's a rebalance here between economic development between the emerging economies and the industrialized world that is larger than what we have in the reform case, as an example. It's a very challenging future, but we believe it's possible. But urgent action is required, and we haven't seen that yet. So this delivers 3 pathways for global GDP, where the world will be 1.8 to 2 times larger, if you like, twofold increase in our total purchasing power. Part of that driven, of course, by population growth. Energy intensity falls. It falls significantly, so the world becomes much more energy efficient in a rebalance case. than in the other scenarios. And then what we've seen historically, the rivalry scenario basically follows the same trajectory that we've seen over the last 20 years in terms of energy efficiency improvement. So the amount of energy we use per dollar of GDP, if you like. And you can see that only the rebalance case then delivers a sufficient energy transition to deliver on the climate goals, and it's because this is the only scenario that is a true transition. We avoid the normal historical energy addition, where every time the economy grows, every time we get a new source of energy, we just put it on top of the old energy sources. I'll come back to that at the end of the presentation. This delivers an energy transition rebalance case where we replace existing sources of energy with new sources of energy, sufficiently so that total energy demand actually falls compared to, in spite of the economy being twice as large. In the two other scenarios, significant energy transition, but not enough. We don't get fossil fuels sufficiently out of the mix. Most of the growth in energy demand is covered by renewables, new renewables, some hydro, some nuclear in those scenarios as well. But we don't get enough growth in those types of energy to replace fossil fuels sufficiently. And then on the CO2 pathways here, I have a set of complex charts, or at least busy charts. CO2, energy-related CO2 emissions, the lines are our scenarios. So you have the rivalry case at the top. Then we have the reform case. And then we have the rebalance case, which is the backcast. So we start out here and then we find a pathway back. That's what we do with rebalance. And if you look at the right chart, this is how the emissions are distributed between the industrialized regions, China, and other emerging regions in the rebalance case. And you can see that the rebalance scenario is basically very close to a net zero emission scenario in 2050 for the industrialized regions. And China is here in this, China has its ambition to go net zero by 2060, and it will in a rebalance case. The challenge is to be able to get the emissions sufficiently fast down in the emerging regions, which are growing, which are energy poor, which has the largest growth in populations. The population in Africa, the population in a rebalance scenario will almost double by 2050. And that's where we are challenged. And it's also, of course, relative to a 1.5 degree scenario. The rebalance scenario is significantly challenged in terms of the speed of the emission reductions. And that's the big difference between a rebalance scenario and a 1.5 degree scenario. Look at IEA's net zero emission scenario, which is a 1.5 degree scenario. That's a better name for it in my mind. And in order for the carbon budget the low carbon budget that is necessary in order to deliver on a 1.5 degree scenario entails that emissions have to come significantly down, not by 2050, but by 2030, and then by 2040. And that's the biggest difference and the biggest challenge. The net zero emission scenario, the IEA, is very much the same as the rebalance scenario, but it's just that the speed and scale of the changes will have to be larger and faster. And then we put in the new scenario, the announced pledges scenario to compare here. You have the STEP scenario, which is above our reform case, et cetera, et cetera. One big difference between one of the reasons why the 1.5 degree scenario IEA delivers lower emissions than we do in the rebalance case is they are more optimistic on CCS, carbon capture and storage. So if I take out the CCS assumptions in the IEA 1.5 degree scenario, we end up with emissions that are very equal to our rebalance case. And vice versa, if I were to put in IEA's carbon capture and storage assumptions, in our scenario, the trajectory would be like this. And by 2050, we would be relatively close. But still the difference here is, of course, that the change in the next decade required in a 1.5 degree scenario, the next 2 decades, are much larger than what we have been able to assume and model in the rebalance case. So that's why the rebalance scenario is we say it's a 1.7, 1.8 degree scenario, depending on what you believe happens after 2050. And just to illustrate some of the difference between the rebalance scenario in our case and the 1.5 degree scenario of the IEA, just look at the assumed changes in oil demand. Required changes in oil demand is a 40% reduction in oil demand the next decade in IEA's case. We have a 10% reduction relative to 2018. then our demand comes down, but it doesn't come sufficient as far down as the IEA assumes. Same story, but with a decade delay for gas. So the gas demand in the IEA net zero scenario falls much more rapidly during the 30s than our gas demand, and then we come after them in the 50s. And then the difference in electricity generation assumptions. In both scenarios, a massive increase in electricity. Electricity will grow as a component of final energy demand. Today, it's only 20% of our energy demand, which is electricity. By 2050, it has to be 45 to 50%. And IEA even more growth than we do. All the growth basically in new renewables, and the growth is also sufficient to take out a lot of fossil fuels in electricity in both cases. We have growth in nuclear, even more so in the IEA scenario than we do. And just growth in nuclear is not a walk in the park. Just if you look at all the nuclear that is being phased out in California, in Belgium, in France, will be phased out in France, in Germany, that has to be replaced, and then you have to double the global capacity in order to deliver a sufficiently stable and green electricity mix by 2050, both IEA and we think that. So in terms of our scenarios, then what are these changes in the different components of the energy system, energy sector? And I talked a bit about electricity already. So all scenarios have massive growth in electricity. All the growth is basically in renewables, some hydro, quite a bit of nuclear, in particular in the rebalance case. And only the rebalance case has such a high growth in these new sources of electricity that we significantly reduce the fossil fuel component, the coal and gas being used in electricity. The two other scenarios don't deliver on that transition of the electricity sector. But there's a massive growth in new renewables in all these scenarios. For a company like ours, Equinor, there will be massive investment opportunities in new renewable electricity, irrespective of scenario. But for the world, it's only a rebalance that delivers sufficient change. Road transport, fuel demand, half of that is light duty vehicles, everything that weighs less than 3.5 tons. The rest is trucking. Massive changes. Even in the reform case, we have lower energy use in road transport in 2050 than we have today, in spite of us being 2 billion more people and potential for a lot of higher car density in many countries that have a low car density today. And electricity will become an important source of road transport fuels in all these scenarios. But only in the rebalance case do we have a sufficient transition so that we reduce overall energy use by 50% from now to 2050. More efficient car fleets, more logistics, car sharing, and of course, moving every car will be electric in 2050. It isn't today. It's much less than 10%. It's 2-3% of the global car fleet, I guess. So and we have more efficient logistics, so we have less trucking. We have some electricity in trucking as well. That's what it looks like in the rebalance case. The rest of transport will also experience changes. Non-road transport, which is basically public transport on rail, and it's shipping and it's aircrafts. Much more efficient. And you could speculate that we probably will fly twice as many air passenger miles in 2050 as we do today, maybe at least. And if that's going to be consistent with the rebalance scenario, then we will have to do that with using less energy, more biofuels, more electricity in railroads and so on, and as a consequence, then much less fossil fuels, so that we don't use more energy. But the non-road transportation sector is more difficult to change a lot than road. In the other sectors, very often we stop when we talk about energy transition. We stop once we've talked about the electricity sector and the possibilities of decarbonizing transport. But then we have the rest of the energy sector. What is that? This is the demand for energy in our manufacturing, what IEA calls industrial demand. So this is the use of energy to produce all the stuff, all our things that we have around us. And in particular in the West, we have a lot of those around us, right? That will become more efficient. It will have to in a rebalance case. It will be more efficient in reform and rivalry too, but not to the same extent. We'll use more electricity in that sector. And since it's decarbonized more, we take emissions down. We'll use less coal directly as input for part of our manufacturing, but there will still probably be coal left. Part of that will then be equipped with carbon capture and storage, because we need coal for some manufacturing processes, probably for the next 30 years. And then we have buildings, maybe 2 billion people more, slightly less in the rebalance case, slightly more in the other cases. That means maybe 1 billion more buildings, homes, and office buildings for the workforce extra. And we think it's possible in a rebalance case, and it has to happen, is that we can deliver all the energy to that sector, cooling, heating, lighting, elevators, using less energy, using much more electricity, take out all coal, hardly have any oil and gas left, all over the world. And if you look at the recent numbers, for instance, in New Delhi, the average size of an Indian apartment is significantly larger than what it was 10 years ago because of the income growth. That requires more energy in it by itself. Demand for air conditioning in New Delhi, with the temperatures they have in New Delhi during the summer in May, June, July, makes a visible dent on electricity demand. All that will continue to grow as the emerging economy, in particular in Asia, becomes richer. And it has to be handled in a way where the rebound effect in energy use in buildings is contained, so that we can use less energy globally. And then we have the non-energy demand, which is basically the feedstock for manufacturing. There's 6 liters of oil in a slightly larger iPhone than this. There probably will be. This is oil, gas, and coal used as molecules in producing all the plastics, all the stuff we have around us, the Tesla, the components making roads, etc., etc. That will be slightly more efficient use, but so it won't grow along in line with consumption. We will recycle much more of this. There will be much more focus on plastic waste, but we still think it will grow. It's a growing component. Then there's been a lot of talk. If it hadn't been for COVID, at least in the energy sector, I guess the word of 2019 would have been hydrogen. And 2020, sorry, would have been hydrogen. So we've tried to, our models were not set up to model hydrogen properly. There's no market for hydrogen as an energy carrier today. And a lot of those of us that are in the business of doing forecasting have been struggling with hydrogen. And generally we make those into sensitivities. What if hydrogen gets a larger role to play as an energy carrier? How would that affect emissions? How would it affect gas demand? How would it affect the need for renewable electricity? So we put in a sensitivity on the rebalance. So in addition to rebalance proper, we've said what happens if we get a real development of hydrogen as a carrier, and we've speculated about what could that be in the 4 key sectors. It will then replace, for instance, in the transport sector, it will replace oil. In power and heat, it will replace the remaining coal and gas, etc., etc. So we have put in a sensitivity just to illustrate what you have to think about. We think that hydrogen, to satisfy this demand, will come from blue hydrogen in the beginning. So that is hydrogen produced on the basis of existing technology, fossil fuels, either coal or gas, with the carbon captured, sequestrated, transported and stored. And then gradually, as that market develops, as we have sufficient amounts of otherwise stranded renewable electricity, if you like, or extra capacity in terms of green electricity, renewable electricity, you can produce hydrogen from electrolysis and put that on top. So then that would look like this. So by 2050, you have a market where more than half of the global hydrogen is produced by electrolysis. So if you do that, you then have to have much more renewable electricity than in the scenario, the rebalance scenario. And since you still have global quite a bit of blue hydrogen, we need much more CCS. And here in this scenario, what we do is we get CO2 emissions further down by 14% roughly in this combination, but we need to increase our assumptions on carbon capture and storage by 75%. So instead of producing 400 of the projects that we're developing in Norway now, which is called Northern Lights, it's 5 million tons a year. We need 2 billion tons. So that's 400 of those projects over the next 30 years. So it's more than is more than one project a month that has to be delivered in the rebalance case, we would then need 75% more than that. So we would need almost 2 of those projects every month from now to 2050. And if you look at the IEA assumptions on carbon capture and storage in their 1.5 degree scenario, it's much more ambitious. Then what does these scenarios mean for oil and gas demand? Well, I've touched upon them already. This is for a chief economist in a large energy company, as usual, when you do these scenarios and then translate them into forecasts for something like oil demand, it becomes a very bad forecast because the variation between these 3 lines is enormous, right? I mean, oil demand could be, in the Ribery case, 110 million barrels per day, 10% higher than it was in 2019. Or if we succeed in a sustainable development, in a policy change that takes place immediately, et cetera, it could go down to 50. There's a massive variation in oil demand. In our case, that is higher than what could potentially be delivered from existing producing fields if we stopped new investments, stopped exploration, and only continue to drill some enhanced oil recovery wells and so on, because we think normally the decline rate globally on average could be somewhere between 3 and 6%. So if we didn't invest in new stuff, we didn't put installations on top of existing resources to make them into reserves and then produce them, global supply of oil would fall by so much that this white area here would be new oil, even in a rebalance case. The gap between the supply curve, if you like, and the demand curve in the rebalance case. That gap is as much new oil the next 30 years as what OPEC in total has delivered over the last 20. So if you have IEA's 1.5 degree demand, you end up roughly down here, and that's why they say that if we are successful in the 1.5 degree scenario they've made, we don't need new investments in new oil and gas fields. But it's a big if there, right? And then on the gas side, the story is basically the same. We get a supply gap relative to the rebalance case, which has to be invested in, which is larger than 60,000 billion cubic meters, 60 trillion cubic meters. That is more new gas over the next 30 years than the combined deliveries of the United States, or actually all of North America, the Middle East, and Russia. So and those are the largest gas suppliers in the world. So even and as IEA also says, that even in a world where we are delivering on a sustainable development path, we will need to invest massively in oil and gas to keep production from falling too fast. And in our case, also then to deliver some new oil and gas production. And then add on to that the massive investments in infrastructure, in new sources of energy, in hydrogen, in carbon capture and storage, in demand management systems, et cetera, et cetera. And that's what it takes. So then the energy transition that we're looking at over the next 30 years, as I've said, is different. And what does it hold? These charts show energy addition over the last 30 years. It's the changes in the energy mix in terms of final energy consumption to the left over the last 30 years, with all sources of energy growing, with the exception of coal for a period, but where we still use much more coal than we did when we signed the Kyoto Agreement in 1997, and roughly stable use of nuclear within the electricity sector. So, but it's growing, and electricity has become a growing share, but has a growing share of final energy consumption, but too slowly. Power generation the same. We use more sources of electricity for all kinds of power than we did in 1990, with the exception of nuclear, and we now can see the growth, fortunately, of wind and solar over the last decade. In a rebalance case, this is what has to happen. So this is a true transition on final consumption. We don't increase our use of energy. We replace existing sources of energy, coal, oil, gas, with new sources within an overall stable and declining use of energy. And we completely revamp the electricity sector with a massive growth in new renewables. And then if you took that on IEA's 1.5 degree scenario, it would just be more of the same. And you can see here, we also have some carbon capture and storage and power towards the end here. So that's what has to happen for the first time in the history of humankind. And that concludes my presentation. So I'll stop sharing now and give the floor back to you, John.
Thank you very much, Eirik. I interpret those slides and your comments thereon as certainly a very sobering message, but that in fact is the intention, I think, of an outlook document that is meant to help to guide decision-making. And so we take that on board, and let me shift now to invite Dr. Jennifer Winter to join us and offer some perspectives that she may have. Dr. Winter, as I mentioned, is with the University of Calgary. Her research there focuses on climate policies and the consequences and trade-offs of government regulation and different policy choices on energy development. She has testified to the Senate of Canada on emissions pricing policies and has advised governments in Canada in various capacities. So, Dr. Winter, we're really glad to have you with us today, and let me pass the floor over to you.
Thank you so much, and good afternoon, everyone. It's morning for me. It's wonderful to be here. I think I want to make 2 points about responding to Eirik's presentation, and just generally when we think about the COVID recovery and the challenge the world faces in moving to net zero. I think the first, and I'm just going to bring it back to Canada for a second, in that so there's an institute called the Canadian Institute of Climate Choices, and it does analysis and modeling to support climate policy. It's arm's length from the government of Canada. And they've done some net zero modeling for Canada, and the way they characterize the potential paths, it was like big scenario analysis over 60 scenarios, and I think like everyone else, it's creating a wide swath of potential outcomes. But the way they characterize the potential paths to net zero is safe bets, which relies on existing technologies and things that we know how to do, such as biofuels, electrification, more of a slow transformation of energy systems. And the other options are what they call wild cards, which are relying on more unproven technologies like carbon capture and storage, direct air capture, et cetera. So I like that framing, and once we get to the discussion, I'd really love to hear Eirik's comments on what safe bets versus wild cards were in Equinor's modeling. The second point I want to make is that we're about 2 weeks away from COP26, where the international community is going to come together, and no surprise, these international conferences and discussions around global action on climate change are complicated, which is why I really appreciated the scenarios that Equinor has in terms of like cooperation versus rivalry. And I think that's a nice way to think about what happens at COP26. And personally, my major concern out of COP26 is that it's going to be more discussion without concrete action. And I think that relates to the point Eirik made about the role of the US in a leadership position. Canada very closely watches US climate policy, and there have been several announcements aimed at aligning Canada's climate policies with the US. Recent news suggests that the Biden administration's very ambitious agenda is being walked back because of the current political environment. And makes me wonder how that will influence negotiations at COP26. I think a key metric of success at COP26 for me would be agreement on some sort of international carbon market. So offset markets, as well as slow but steady progress toward consistency across in policy mechanisms across different jurisdictions. I mean, there's discussion about border carbon adjustments, there's discussion about carbon taxes, and I think in the state of the world where there's more cooperation, it'll be because there is agreement on the appropriate climate policy so that they're consistent across jurisdictions. And I think we underestimate the benefit that has for clear policy signals for multinational businesses like Equinor, and encouraging concerted movement on climate and consistency in how energy systems transform. I think I should stop there. Really looking forward to the discussion.
Thank you very much, Jennifer. Let's now be joined, if I could ask, by Dr. James Glynn. James is a colleague of mine, as I said at the outset, at the Center on Global Energy Policy. He has over 15 years of experience within energy systems analysis and energy technology research, development, and deployment, and has collaborated in those areas with governments, technologists, and energy analysts across the United States, Europe, and Asia. He works especially closely with the International Energy Agency's Energy Technology Systems Analysis Program, and brings from that perspective a rich set of observations to this discussion. James, over to you.
Great, thanks, John. Thanks for the introduction. Eirik, thanks very much for a very interesting presentation. I enjoyed going through the report, and also enjoyed your refreshing presentation of it just there. There's some really useful and insightful numbers in this year's Energy Perspectives, and you've gone through the headline impacts of COVID on the economy, the energy system changing quarter by quarter over the last 20 months. There's these long-term trends, and then there's the volatility that we're starting to see with the energy crunch in Europe and what's happening in China. We've also seen that the large economic contraction in 2020, the lockdowns, the brief collapse in oil demand, combined with the number of ambitious net zero 2050 policy announcements in the run-up to COP26 at Glasgow. And this all points to, as you've just said, a massive range of uncertainty to the energy systems outlook. So I don't envy you in your job. The report and presentation does a really useful job at outlining the current short-term outlook, which is quite stable. And then you've provided some very nice numbers and interesting points of note. In the back of the report, you go into some nice details, I suppose, lifting the hood on energy systems models, and also more thinking on what's coming down the road from Equinor's perspective. So I'm going to focus just in my comments on some of those details, and hopefully we can get back to these in the conversation. So I'm really interested in some of the comments about the resource intensity of modern lifestyles in the developed world, and that the report comments that they've become unsustainable. The report talks about overconsumption and waste have become a rule of thumb rather than exceptions in many parts of the world. And even with countries, the distribution of access to energy and the services that this energy brings is wildly unequal. This also has damages to health, and proximity to climate damages are also unevenly distributed. How these energy intensity and resource intensive lifestyles change in the near term as a result of COVID, and how these changes will endure, will have considerable impacts on what's possible on energy intensity in transport and oil demand, and how quick the energy transition can progress. Here in CJEP, we're also thinking about these uncertainties in energy intensity and how climate impacts will impact on equity in the energy transition. I also find it really interesting and very refreshing the comments about economic growth undoubtedly being positive, but that resource-intensive growth in the richest economies is now only bringing marginal improvements to living standards with high environmental damage, that these living standards are not improving fast enough in the poorest countries. So you'll know that when we build these energy systems models, macroeconomic growth and the energy intensity of energy service demands is a key lever in how these models produce their outlooks. So the report really refreshingly suggests that society and welfare could be optimized around other indicators of human development, well-being, and the environment. I found this really refreshing and really useful to develop our thinking about how energy modeling and energy uncertainty into the future might take those comments on board. It's very well in line with the SSP1 narratives within the academic literature and energy systems modeling that is one of the main scenarios in the IPCC that is, achieves net zero and achieves a sustainable future at a reasonable cost, assuming lots of other idealized situations. Again, it was refreshing the conversation, or the points about the need for technology transfer and provision of finance to allow increased investment in emerging countries. This is critical, and again, in the literature, without globalization, without technology transfer and financial flows, the rebalance scenario seems very unlikely. I also really commend Equinor for including carbon budgets in their backcasting perspectives. This is really refreshing to see from my perspective, that openness and transparency. Also, the comment about high carbon prices being necessary in the absence of a global carbon price, and the also conversations about the carbon border adjustment mechanisms in Europe. Again, really refreshing. It'd be nice to talk a bit about what a carbon price might be and what it might be necessary, and what Equinor's perspective on that might be. And my last point is about the hydrogen. I find it very interesting from an energy systems perspective. You were talking about the need for green and blue hydrogen, and how this will create a demand and an extra pressure on renewable energy, both from solar and wind. But equally, I think we probably do different types of modeling. I won't get into the weeds on the modeling side, but from engineering side of energy systems modeling, we need hydrogen for long-term storage, going beyond the short-term storage availability from batteries. So when we're talking about short-term demand balancing and flexibility in the power sector, we see this need for long-term energy storage to get beyond those kind of 2 weeks of low wind in Europe and elsewhere around the world. So I see this synergy between the conversation about hydrogen, both enabling syn fuels and low carbon industry and hopefully low carbon international aviation, but also hydrogen will enable higher levels of renewables on the grid. So I think there's a synergy there, more so than just hydrogen putting additional pressure on renewables to make low carbon hydrogen. And also, if we get the chance, I'd be really interested to talk about how Equinor views this level of uncertainty, the range. How does Equinor make a sense of that outlook for oil demand into the future? It's going to become increasingly important as we go forward. So thanks, John. I'll leave my comments there, and I'll look forward to the discussion, Eirik. Thanks very much.
Thank you very much, James. Thank you also to the many members of the audience who have found that Q&A button at the bottom of your Zoom screen and are feeding questions into us. We're going to have just a couple of minutes of questions from your moderator, and then we'll come to the audience. For those of you who are watching online, let me remind that my name is John Elkind. I'm with the Center on Global Energy Policy. I'm joined today by Eirik Wærness, Senior Vice President and Chief Economist of Equinor, Jennifer Winter, who is an Associate Professor with the University of Calgary, and James Glynn, also from the Center on Global Energy Policy. Let me start, if I could, first of all, by opening the opportunity to you, Eirik, to respond to anything that your fellow commentators have directed to you. We'll try to keep this moving along quickly because we have way more questions and topics than time available. But let me open that opportunity to you first, and when you're done, I'll come at you with a first question from my side.
Yeah, and there were a lot of comments and questions hidden in those comments, but thanks for very good and good reflections, and also reflections that I recognize and that I associate with, if you like. On the issue of safe bets versus wild guesses, if you like, in the scenarios, I mean, it's there's a, I guess in particular in both in the scenario, these two extreme scenarios, if you like, the rivalry scenario and the rebalancing cases, in some cases, of course, based on a series of what you sometimes would call wild guesses, and we all have some safe bets in here, which is sort of a general productivity development globally, where one of the uncertainties would be how is that distributed among the countries in the world. But on those two extreme scenarios, if you take the rebalance scenario as an example, of course, guessing about the level of carbon capture and storage, guessing about the possibility of adding more nuclear to the electricity system to avoid as much growth in intermittent renewables, guessing about the costs and capital costs and availability, if you like, of the enormous growth in batteries, for instance, that we need. I mean, just to satisfy to get to 100% global electric light-duty vehicle fleet in 2050, we need more than 60% of the new car sales in 2030 to be electric, because of the replacement ratio in the car fleets, right? And that's a 20 to 30-fold increase in the required materials for batteries globally compared to what we have at the moment. And that's only for the light-duty vehicles. And then a little bit on I guess on one of your comments, James, on the electricity system as well, is that the storage, the composition of an electricity system in 2050 with that much intermittent, how do you combine then? What's the role of hydrogen to avoid batteries, for instance, for the short-term storage? Can we use batteries for longer-term storage in 2050 with new technology? We can't today. So that all that, where are the minerals going to come from? So there's a lot of wild guesses, and it's more the system, sort of the system thinking, the ability to reduce demand, to demand manage, to have energy intensity. Nobody turn on their water heater in the middle of the night, because it's automatically regulated. We don't charge our car in Norway at 8 o'clock in the morning now, because the electricity price is 5 times as much as we're used to. So, but how do you make that automatic? That's also a digital challenge and so on. So there are a lot of those. COP26, I'm also hopeful that we will have more measures come out of COP than we have been used to, and relatively less weight on increasingly hairy targets by someone who is not responsible for delivering on them in 2050. So we need more measures and less talk about targets for a longer period. I'm hopeful, but I don't think it's very likely in the current situation. But where I would like to see something that was where we didn't deliver in Paris is much more binding financing mechanisms to finance the transition in the emerging economies. And the $100 million a year that was part of the Paris Agreement, and where Trump pulling out of that reduced the hopes for that. Biden coming in, the Democratic administration coming in, increases the hope for that. But the $100 billion is too little. So those are at least some that uncertainty on oil demand. I'll just take that. Yes, it's enormous. And how do you handle that? Well, we are used to, and that's for energy companies. A lot of the uncertainty, which is massive, the uncertainty on our current production, current products, oil, gas related products. The uncertainty on climate change is very much handled in the way we handle price uncertainty. They will translate into varying wholesale prices for the energy that we provide. So a world with very low demand compared to a world with higher demand will require resources that have a much lower marginal cost of being delivered. And you can speculate about that. In a rebalance type of world, that would probably be a lot of resources coming out of the Middle East, because that scenario presumes that we are in a geopolitically very benign environment. And then it's okay for the world that the Middle East will dominate the remaining oil supply. because they have the cheapest resources. To some extent, they have the most carbon intensive resources, and it also facilitates the ability of those countries to be part of the energy transition, to allow them to have a large share of income. And then in a rivalry case, with more volatility, so it's going to be more price volatile as well, but a much higher price, because we need more high cost resources. We might even need some oil sands out of Canada in that scenario, right? But that's how we handle it. A lot of this is price uncertainty. And then of course the future electricity market. Look at the variation today in Europe, which is increasingly affected by intermittent renewables. And when it doesn't blow and it's cold, electricity prices are going to be very volatile. There will be zero for many hours a year if we have a lot of renewables and we don't have a proper market design. But then they can also be very high. So the volatility in electricity prices going forward for a wholesale producer can also be massive.
So I'd like to jump in on the way that you've combined two things that I think are useful to shed a little bit more light on. You said at the outset, these are scenarios. These are not predictions. Nonetheless, I think that it is almost always the case when the lay community interacts with scenarios that come from the energy sector, for example, the way that those scenarios are interpreted is Equinor predicts X. Let's take the immediate case of the energy crisis, the supply crisis that is being experienced in many places around the globe. Could you please talk a little bit, Eirik, and then Jennifer and James, please jump in. How should one think about the way that prices have moved through this autumn of 2021, Northern Hemisphere autumn? Should past scenario analyses have helped us to think through the possibility of price dynamics that have been unfolding or not? Should we have been surprised or not?
Well, I think first of all, there's a difference between long-term scenario modeling and very short-term. And if you do short-term scenario modeling, you will have to think about short-term price elasticities, and then you were focusing on a lot of things that illustrate and that results in the type of volatility that we've seen in prices over this year. And you can go back to the opposite price reaction and what happened in 2014 when the oil price fell by 50% over a period of 3 to 6 months, if I remember correctly. And because in the long-term scenarios, then you have a different set of elasticities, both on the demand and supply side, and you can't model business cycles and volatility generally around those types of long-term trends, right? So whether we should be surprised, I guess it depends. Are you surprised by the weather in Europe this summer, that it didn't blow as much as but what we shouldn't be surprised at is that when you have relatively small changes in the fundamental drivers here, which is supply and demand, that you get very large price changes in markets where you have low, short, and long-term price elasticity. So in the case of oil in 2014, I think we were surprised roughly on the negative side by a weakening of the global balance, which was 1.5 to 2% of the total volume. So say 1 million barrels, something, and most of that was a reduction in demand in China. We were surprised. Weakening balance, it was enough to send oil prices down by 50%. Same thing here. It's relatively small changes both on the supply side of gas that came together in a perfect storm with a very cold winter first in Asia, then in Europe. The UK had its coldest winter coldest April since 1947 this year. So, and then with the demand pickup after COVID, and you combine that then with extra or with the normal sources of intermittent electricity not being there, so you get a marginally increasing gas demand and coal demand for electricity as well. We're not having enough gas to replenish storage in Europe in the summer. The Russians have not delivered more gas to Europe than they normally do in spite of this, because they also have to replenish their own storage. That is enough to send gas prices skyrocketing, also because of fear of what might happen if we get another cold winter. So that is a normal, but of course that nobody can predict the type, sort of the size of the impact that we're seeing now, and that's also because it's about expectations of what might happen in January, February here. That's also what drives the gas prices.
So certainly the difference between short-term versus longer-term scenario projections, very useful. Jennifer, James, please jump in if you wish, as much as possible. I'd like this to be very much a give and take. Any thoughts from either of you?
Sure. Just a short comment is that I think when we're thinking about the short-term short-term energy markets, I think we also shouldn't ignore the continued disruption of COVID-19, in that it the world all of a sudden changed how we live and work, and the recovery has been in many ways one step forward, two steps back, depending on where you are, and that's it's been incredibly disruptive for not just planning but supply of energy because of the additional safety requirements. And so I think like this sort of issue is going to be persistent for quite some time. And I think it's, what I think will be really interesting is when we think about how supply chains have been disrupted by COVID-19, and there are lots of instances in the past where there have been issues around supply chain disruptions from, say, the financial crisis, and there's talking heads like us will say, oh, maybe we'll finally learn and move away slightly from just-in-time things like that. And I wonder if COVID is actually going to result in those types of changes, or we'll just go back to sort of business as usual on the energy side as well. I think it'll be a really interesting open question to keep watching.
Got it. James, anything from your side?
Yeah, I'll jump in there quickly. I know we're short on time, but I think Erik's point about using the right models for the right kind of questions is a really critical one. And let's not forget that we, as Jennifer says, we're just the year after COVID with a massive demand shock, increased huge volatility. Nobody was certain what the demand for oil was going to be this year. So you're using long-term models to predict or to look at a short-term cycle that they're just not well suited to use. So we had uncertainty that just compounded and created a vicious cycle of more uncertainty. On the energy crunch in Europe, and just to add some thoughts on that, the wind in Europe is currently outside. Sorry, during the summer it was currently outside the 20-year range. So very few people, certainly not normal energy systems modelers, would include weather variability within their long-term scenario analysis. There's far too many other uncertainties and other policy and fundamental dynamics that will drive uncertainty much larger. So like the ones I mentioned, the energy intensity of demand will generally have a much higher impact on what the energy system will or how it will transition. But in this case, the fact that wind is outside the 20-year range is causing big short-term problems.
That's a useful point to make, and I know, James, that this is kind of near and dear to your heart as you and colleagues are working with the New York Power Authority on exactly this question of how a changing climate implies changing design requirements for energy systems as well. A really important topic. Let me return to you, Eirik, with one other question, and then we'll open up to some of the questions coming from the audience. It's striking that you had the two slides that show the unmet demand for oil and then for natural gas going forward. And that comes in the face of an accelerated rebalance build out of new decarbonized energy systems. And that speaks to the need to hold in one's head at one time two ideas: the sustaining of legacy energy systems until we no longer need them in the forms that they have functioned, and the building of the new one. Now, it may have come to your notice that for those of us such as myself who live in Washington, we struggle to hold two complicated ideas in our head at the same time. Could you please talk a little bit about this need to invest simultaneously in both the new energy economy, if I might put it that way, and also the legacy energy economy?
Yeah, it's always difficult to have two thoughts in your head at the same time, I guess, and so we tend to talk about sequentially, right? And even IEA pointed out when they delivered their net zero emission scenario that we don't need any new investments in new oil fields. We need a lot of new investments, but not in new fields. And then a couple of months later, they pointed to the fact that there might be too little oil in the world in a couple of years, right? So yes, we have to invest, and we have to invest massively, though in a world like the rebalance scenario, probably less going forward for the next 30 years per year than we have over the last decade in oil and gas. But we can't stop now. And the signals that the industry is getting have to be sufficient in terms of either profitability or framework conditions or license to operate, access to licenses to some extent, to be able to develop some of the resources that we should develop and avoid the least efficient resources or the most complex type of crude oil, the most polluting ones. And at the same time, have sufficient capital to invest in all the new stuff. And the line of sight to what electricity markets will look like in 2030, 2040, when we have much larger shares of intermittent renewables around the world, is not a given. There's a shortage of renewable projects. There's a lot of capital. It's a lot of financial capital, but the stream of projects that are investable is too low. So that needs to be made available. There's different, and that's about the property rights. It's about the government framework conditions, and this is not only about the well-regulated, well-known energy markets in Europe or in Northeast USA, where energy demand is basically flat. It's about replacing coal-fired electricity with something else. But this is about emerging economies that have very different framework conditions, different government, different country risks, and then someone has to go in there with financial capital, make it into real capital, put in place the wind turbines, the solar panels, the infrastructure, the storage, and hope to make money on it. And that slows it down. And we have to do both of these, right? And when we talk about this, and when I often get questions also about what is the sort of the silver bullet that you forgot? Is it fusion? Is it hydrogen? Is it nuclear? Is it carbon capture and storage? Is it natural sinks? It's all of the above. There is no silver bullet. We have to do it all. And we will probably make mistakes as well. And if we make mistakes, the transition will be slower and more costly. Some people will lose money. There will be stranded assets of new assets as well, not only old assets. The large players in the energy sector, we have legacy assets, we have legacy cash flows that we will use to invest also in the new stuff.
Right. I hope Jennifer and James are not going to be just polite, but we'll jump straight in with thoughts to contribute. But let me grab one point that was posed in the question and answer section, which is, you said no silver bullets, but how do you think about technology breakthroughs such as fusion, how are you framing your thoughts around the role of nuclear, et cetera?
Well, I guess a massive breakthrough in something like cold fusion, and there are some very interesting things happening right now on fusion, will have significant impacts that has not been modeled by anyone yet. One of the reasons is, of course, that when you have those breakthroughs, generally it takes decades for it to scale up and in particular in an energy system that is still growing and where we still have a lot of legacy assets that has to be competed out or forcibly shut down. But that could change this. I mean, fusion could change it. We talked about that when I was a kid, and we probably still talk about it. And there's really interesting things happening there. And then there will be a lot of technological breakthroughs here that will happen all the time in terms of demand management, in terms of more efficient use of energy. How do we avoid rebound effects when buildings become more efficient? How do you make incentives for this? But in the bigger scheme of things, nuclear will have to be made more cost competitive. That could be modular, small, traditional fission nuclear. But it's very hard to speculate exactly about what that is. Direct air capture of billions of tons of CO2, potentially. How can you make that happen within an energy equation where everything has to be more efficient? What's the energy use of capturing CO2 out of thin air? So a lot of, and that will happen gradually, but we don't put in sort of the black swan type of thing coming to the rescue in 2030, sort of magically in the rebalance case of scenario.
Can I come in there, John?
Please, by all means. And
John.
Jennifer, when James is done, just jump in, please.
Eric, you mentioned something there that myself and colleagues at the centre, Erin, we're working on stranded assets and gas flows. You mentioned the need for market signals or strong signals to industry for the long-term use of existing assets. And so when we start thinking about the energy transition, it often starts in the power sector. And so we start thinking about, variable renewables, and that's fine. We have capacity markets, we have energy markets, and we're starting to think about ancillary service markets. So like I already talked about, the need for hydrogen, the need for flexibility on the grid, the need for hydrogen, other things, inertia on the grid. But just in recent conversations, then we started to go one level deeper. How does the gas supply market, with very little existing flexibility, very little storage, it's all line pack with some storage, start to think about volatile capacity factors on gas power plants and then ultimately on gas transmission? So say we have really high renewables generation during the summer with wind and solar. It's more likely that we'll have low capacity factors for wind and solar in the off season, so in the autumn and in the spring, than in the winter and summer. So in those, like the winter and summer, we might have low gas demand. But then in the off seasons, there could be really highly volatile gas demands. Like, how do we start to think about the market signals for gas suppliers to keep those assets active? Because they're not just going to be energy demand. There's some other market signal that needs to be there to keep those assets active, to provide the balancing market that we need. I don't know if you thoughts on that.
It's a capacity market type of discussion, market design issue that will be both important for the electricity part of the market here, the gas-driven electricity market, so the CCGTs, if you like, or the open gas-fired plants. And then you will increasingly, as you say, potentially also have a capacity issue in terms of the gas market more in general, depending on what happens in manufacturing and in heating. And then it's about who holds storage, who holds the assets ready, the infrastructure ready to transport the gas to the user when demand goes up and down. So, and that's also part of this, right?
But isn't part of the solution improved and increased integration of electricity systems to balance that that volatility, like across jurisdictions? So I'm thinking of, in Canada, most of our provinces have islanded electricity systems, and I think the US does a little bit better in that sense. But if we're really thinking about avoiding volatility, it's really going to require integration of energy systems to an extent that's like much more than right now.
Yeah. No, I completely agree. It's there's a fantastic map of where you can see the hourly electricity mix in Nova Scotia and compare that to Quebec. And Quebec has hydroelectricity, Nova Scotia has coal. And that's the case in many places in Europe as well. So, but then you have to have investments signals, or you have to have a national regulated natural monopoly type of grid operator do the investments in the infrastructure. Power capacity, transportation, and gas transportation capacity between Spain and France, as an example, through the Pyrenees, is very, very low. And in a future Europe where you have massive solar surplus at some point, and you have rain in Germany, you could transport electricity through Europe. One of the problems is, of course, that on the electricity side, it's generally dark in Europe throughout the winter. So it's the seasonal variation. You got to do something about that. I mean, the efficiency of a solar plant in northern Germany in December is much, much less than in July. So you also have the seasonal variation, but you're right. I mean, infrastructure, it has to be storage, it has to be grids. You have to have the local grids expanded as well to handle the variation over the day, et cetera, et cetera. So that's part of the system, part of the challenge as well, but part of the solution. And it's happening.
Sorry, go ahead.
No, I'm done. We need time for some more questions.
All right, let's shift to a series of questions around hydrogen, if I could. I mean, this hydrogen ends up capturing a lot of attention and imagination from people, but with lots of points that are uncertain and contested. One of the most contested aspects of it is hydrogen from what power source and feedstock. And so, for example, Rachel Pritzker in the Q&A section says, why is it one doesn't hear discussion about hydrogen from nuclear power, as an example? Juho Lippanen asks a question about investment levels in blue hydrogen, suggesting that they are insufficient to see the kind of growth that was posited in your rebalance scenario, if I understand his question correctly. A third question is, you have a very considerable share of the total hydrogen supply suggested as plausibly coming from blue hydrogen, namely natural gas with CCS. Often one hears the discussion that, gee, that's just the kind of the oil and gas companies finding a way to secure their continued economic operation. Why is that not the right answer? Why is blue hydrogen, why would one think that you will not simply leap to renewables-based hydrogen? So a complex of hydrogen questions, and if you could talk a little bit about that, and I do hope that, again, James and Jennifer will jump in as they wish right away. Go ahead, please.
Yeah, no, it's a really interesting discussion, and I think one of the challenges that we're facing is that, as I said, there's not a market for hydrogen as an energy carrier. So we have to think about what is that market going to look like. We have hydrogen in ammonia, but we don't have it as an energy carrier, and one of the problems of the discussion is that we're talking mainly talking about this like we do in most of the energy transition debate on the supply side. But what about the demand side is another uncertainty, and I didn't talk about that. But what's the cost of actually replacing equipment and then use hydrogen? I don't think we don't think hydrogen is going to play any role in light duty vehicles, and one of the reasons is that it's electricity has already won that maybe, but it's also the cost of the tank, just to avoid leakage, as an example. So how do you, and then the cost of replacing to hydrogen for the users. If you take that away, then it's what about the supply of hydrogen? Well, it has to be produced. Doesn't exist in the nature as a free molecule. You have to produce it from something. Two alternatives. One of them exists today as a technology, which is electrolysis. Requires a lot of electricity. The key challenge in energy transition and the low-hanging fruit in carbon emission reduction is that we got to change our electricity system. So we have to decarbonize the electricity system. So putting on an extra source of demand for electricity to produce hydrogen doesn't make sense if your marginal source of electricity is coal. So we need all the renewables we can get to decarbonize the electricity, to address other ways of electricity demand is growing. And then at some point, we have surplus electricity, maybe because of varying intermittent production, that we can use for electrolysis, if we have the water. We don't have water all the time, but we need water to produce hydrogen. If you can have electrolysis plants that also can vary their production according to the varying input, otherwise you need to put them on the grid and have electricity all the time. So that also has an impact. It can be done, but it has an impact. Then you have blue hydrogen. The technology is there already, because this is easier carbon capture and storage than post-combustion. It's cheaper than doing it with electricity, even with the current ETS prices in Europe. So for the consumer to shift from something to hydrogen, for instance, natural gas to hydrogen, the blue hydrogen is now cheaper than electricity. That might change 15 years down the road, but right now. And then, of course, as in everything we're talking about here, there's not sufficient investments, but things are happening. So we are working in Northern Europe and other places as well to try and develop blue hydrogen types of projects. But the CCS challenge is a problem, right? Not because of the capture, but because of where to store it. Who accepts a CO2 storage? Who wants to pay for the transport and the storage costs when carbon price is too low? Europe is the only place where there's a meaningful alternative price. So, and some other places. So we need, as Jennifer said in the beginning, you know, the carbon price issue to kickstart some of the changes here is that's a serious issue. We need carbon to get a cost.
Right.
Can I come in there, John, just briefly on the
Please,
CCS?
yeah.
Eric, it was something that I was really fascinated by in the report, that Equinor has probably the longest experience with the CCS for EOR in Sleipner, and relatively speaking to the IEA with 7.6 gigatons of CO2 capture by 2050, and some of the global integrated settlement models with CO2 capture in the order of 10, 15, some of them even 20 gigatons. What's your perspective? You've capped at 2 gigatons, and I'd really be interested to know what underpins that decision. Or, I mean, it's obviously a lot of experience in Sleipner, but if there's more you could talk about, that'd be really useful.
Well, part of it is, of course, that if we had chosen to take a 1.5 degree carbon budget for our rebalance scenario, then we would need to postulate that we need more natural sinks or carbon capture and storage projects. So in a sense, the carbon capture number that we have by 2050 is not a bottom-up type of investments where we evaluate the possibilities and the size of the projects and so on, but it's basically what is needed to get down to our carbon budget in a sense. But if you look at the challenge of it, having reservoirs where you can store 2 billion tons a year in a situation where we hardly have anything now, and this is just for the storage. This is generally not IOR, because we're not going to produce a lot more oil, right? So this is basically a system where you need a market design for a waste dump, which is where CO2 is the waste. Somebody gets paid to store it and guarantee it doesn't leak. It could be thousands of kilometers away from the source, especially if a country like Germany doesn't want the carbon capture storage. Well, they got to get rid of the carbon somewhere. So there's also about transport and capture. So and then how quickly can this grow? And when you look at we're building a 5 million ton per year facility now in Norway, selling that capacity to potential emitters like steel plants in Europe and so on. It takes a while to build it. So that is also how to repeat that. And we haven't looked for these reservoirs globally either. So we have to start doing this. Is another type of exploration activity. And we can find large ones, but they have to be very large to pass 2 billion tons before 2050. And not to mention 20 billion tons, which was some of these IPCC scenarios have. Right? But Jennifer, they can be right. I hope they're right.
Care to jump in, Jennifer?
Sure, just briefly. I think one of my concerns about the colors of hydrogen is really that it's sometimes placing artificial emphasis on the production method, whereas if we're controlling the emissions problem, via carbon tax or a cap and trade system or regulations, it doesn't necessarily matter what color the hydrogen is. And so it's I sometimes I worry we get fixated on labels as a bit of a distraction for the actual importance of policies to address the real problem, which is emissions. And I think the other comment I want to make on this is that I also worry about governments picking winners in supporting or not supporting technology. Like there's an obvious role for governments in supporting research and development in new technologies because of the importance of knowledge spillovers. But what's more important is setting policy certainty and true market systems that will enable adoption of new technologies or new energy types, whether it's hydrogen or fuel cells or small modular reactors. This is, I think, the one thing we're missing is governments that are willing to make long-term policy signals that support net zero transition.
Yeah, I strongly agree with that. This is if there ever was a place where you should let 1,000 flowers blossom, that's within this field, and not picking winners, and general long-term framework conditions for research and development, and then let the markets work.
Well, Jennifer, thank you for that, and because it puts a pretty useful punctuation mark at the end of our discussion. It has really been a pleasure to be with you all today, and I wish to thank Eirik Wærness, Jennifer Winter, and James Glenn for all of your remarks. Thank you to the audience for tuning in. I am told that Eirik's presentation will be made available in a PDF form in the coming period. I assume that will be through our website, which is energypolicy.columbia.edu, and that is where also you will be able to find the video of today's program. Our next event, which seems well sequenced because there's been so much discussion of some of the IEA findings in this space today. Our next event will explore the newly released IEA World Energy Outlook 2021. That will be with Tim Gould, who's the chief energy economist at IEA, and that will be on Thursday, October 28th at noon Eastern time in the United States. For a full calendar of upcoming events, please visit our website at the Center on Global Energy Policy. That link has just been put in the chat. It's energypolicy.columbia.edu, and then you'll see a section on news and events below that. I thank you again very much to everybody for participating, and particularly to our speakers. This has been a great discussion, and hope you have a successful remainder of your day. Thank you very much, and goodbye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.